I'm always glad to hear from listeners to the briefing. Just write me at mail@albertmohler.com. And I'm thrilled with the questions that come, such smart, intelligent questions. And I like to talk about the ones I think will really help other people also to think some of these issues through. A young man from Oklahoma writes, and he's writing asking a question about nationalism, patriotism, and the city of God by the towering theological figure of the early church, Augustine. And this is what he writes. He says, quote, "I sense there is a distinction between patriotism and nationalism. American patriotism seems rooted in gratitude, sacrifice, freedom, and a foundation for Christian morality, or of Christian morality. Nationalism, on the other hand, appears to be a kind of ultimate allegiance that seeks to preserve the nation at all costs." Is that a fair assessment? And he talks about Augustine's city of God, reminding us that our true home is in the heavenly city, but God has left us by his providence here in the earthly city with a mission. So let's talk about this. Number one, the word patriotism and the word nationalism. It's very interesting that this is a very bright young man who writes in saying that he sees a distinction. American patriotism, he says, seems rooted in gratitude, sacrifice, freedom, and a foundation of Christian morality. I think all those things belong together, except perhaps the foundation of Christian morality. I think some people would define patriotism just basically as gratitude for sacrifice and freedom, and say that those who have fought in wars and protect the nation. But let's remind ourselves of the derivation of the word. Patria refers to father, refers to fatherland, the land of our fathers. And of course, it means fathers and mothers. But the point is, the word patriotism might actually be a tighter word than the word nationalism. And in the 20th century, patriotism, understood rightly, etymologically, may have been a more dangerous word than nationalism. You raise a very good issue. What should be a Christian patriotism? And I would argue that, informed by Scripture, a Christian patriotism should be thankful for the fact that God has given us preserving units in human society that turn out to be worthy of our allegiance and worthy of our faithfulness and worthy of our love and worthy of our common commitment. And it is true that our fatherland, our motherland, the place where we have been given life and in which we've been raised and has given us great blessings, we owe a certain allegiance, and there's the word patriotism to it. It becomes an even more important issue, I think, when you understand the particular nature of America as a project. And so the United States of America was begun to establish a new patria. A new order of the ages is actually a part of the original American experiment. It was a reset. And this is where we have to remember there's continuity and there's discontinuity. The American Revolution, I often argue, was both continuity and discontinuity. What the American revolutionaries were trying to overthrow was not Western civilization. They were seeking to perpetuate and extend Western civilization. They even largely extended the Anglosphere. So even the political patterns of Britain and Britain's larger culture, they were just Americanized and brought over, and I think improved upon, frankly, in terms of the American constitutional order. And so in continuity, what kind of statement were the founders of this country trying to make in terms of continuity? What kind of architecture did they use? They went to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. How are so many of the founders, including most famously George Washington, often portrayed? In classical garb, like they're walking in Athens or walking in Rome. This country was built upon discontinuity, yes, a new order of the ages, but absolute continuity with the Western civilizational pattern, which honestly the nation's founders and the framers of the constitutional order saw as their ambition. They understood both parts of that. Okay, patriotism is tied to that, and I think it's probably the most commonly used word about our proper allegiance, proper devotion, proper appreciation, proper celebration. But there are obviously limits to patriotism. That doesn't mean my country right or wrong. It is my country, right or wrong, but our duty, especially in a constitutional republic, is to seek to make it right rather than wrong. We have a responsibility here. It's quite different than if we were living under a totalitarian government or an autocracy. Patriotism is a good word. I'm not embarrassed by it. I think a proper patriotism, I like that phrase. I grew up hearing that phrase. Christians are called to a proper patriotism, and that's one that's biblical, one that understands the state can't claim ultimate allegiance. It can claim an earthly allegiance, And in fact, it can and should. Okay, so the other word is nationalism. And this man, again, very intelligently writes, it appears to be a kind of ultimate allegiance that seeks to preserve the nation at all costs. Is that a fair assessment? No, I don't think it is. But I can understand in current usage why you might think that. I would argue that nation, and that's a word that, of course, is used in English, but we could go back to linguistic origins. But for one thing, I want to go back to the table of the nations found in Genesis, in which you have the establishment by God's providence of different nations, different. Well, you say first that might mean ethnic groups, but they're going to be gathered in different nations. And thus, you look at the Old Testament, you already have the rise of groups are identified as nations. Israel is identified as a nation. At one point, Judah is also identified as a nation. And there are other nations around them. Israel is surrounded by powerful nations that want to extinguish it. So the word nation, I don't think is a problem at all. And in fact, I'm going to argue for a certain form of nationalism. And so why and how? I don't believe in any kind of idolatrous nationalism, a form of fascism. And yes, the 20th century warned us that those kinds of things can happen. That's where the state takes on an ultimate allegiance. The nation is really positioned in eschatological terms. And sometimes American Christians can be tempted to talk that way, as if America is the final destiny of history. It isn't. The kingdom of Christ is, and that's Augustine you raise. It's the heavenly city where we have our primary citizenship, and that's where we place our greatest hopes. We don't put ultimate hopes in the earthly kingdom, even the earthly kingdom of the United States of America. But going back to the table of the nations, I think there is a basic biblical principle, and it comes down to the Christian principle of subsidiarity. And that is that there are basic units that cannot be jumped over and have human flourishing. You can't jump over marriage. You can't jump over the family. You can't just jump to neighborhood. You can't just jump to city. You can't just jump. Here's one of the most fundamental conservative insights of the 20th century. And Margaret Thatcher put it in her own inimitable way. When she was asked about the importance of society, she said, "I don't believe it exists." Now, let me just say, I think there is such a thing as society, but I think what Margaret Thatcher was saying is it's an abstraction. You talk about society, and it's a way of avoiding talking about families, marriages, neighborhoods, cities. Society is an abstraction, and politics should be about the specific. Okay, but when you talk about a nation, I think a nation, over the course of history, however you're going to define it, and it's a pretty stable term right now. It's fascinating to see that between the beginning of the 19th century and the end of the 20th century, one of the most stable concepts that wasn't stable before is the concept of nation. And you could look at such developments as the Treaty of Westphalia. You could look at the Congress of Vienna in the 19th century. And then, of course, you could look at the various chapters of the 20th century. And so by the time you get to the end of the 20th century, you look at a map, you see nations, everyone pretty much knows what they are. And I think we can fail to see that's a kind of an innovation. It used to be kingdoms. It used to be empires. It used to be amorphous things. And there was terra incognita. Who knows what's there? So that's one of the achievements. I believe that in the providence of God and in respect to creation order, the nation is a unit that is biblically recognized. Now, I'm not saying the United States of America. I'm not saying that it has to be a nation that's transcontinental between the Atlantic and the Pacific in North America with 50 states. I am saying that there's a limitation. So let me just tell you the alternative. The alternative is the absence of nations. What do you have? A global civilization? Okay, here's a clear biblical principle. There is no such thing as a global civilization. I mean, frankly, some nations can get so large that you have to question whether that's a manageable civilization. But the globalist ambitions of the far left, and frankly, of the cultural elites in the 20th century, even someone like Woodrow Wilson in the League of Nations, whatever it was either going to be nations or a league. It wasn't really a League of Nations. And I would say the same thing about the United Nations. I don't want it to just disappear, because someone's going to recreate it somewhere else. And I agree with Harry Truman. If you're going to have it where the United States can get to it right quick, and we can decide who can fly into the United States or not. The last thing we want is a United Nations located in, I don't know, Paris or Geneva or somewhere. So it's a problem, but I think Harry Truman was right. It's a problem we're going to keep close at home rather than to let it get far away. The United Nations, by definition, isn't united. You have a Security Council in which you have several countries with a veto, a single veto power, and it's been used almost every crucial point in the history of the United Nations. It has shown disunity rather than unity. And the spectacular failure of the United Nations to bring about a peace or prosperity or any other human good. I'm not saying it never does anything right. I'm just saying if it does so, it would have been more efficiently done by someone else already. I think there's also a Christian understanding of the nation as requiring pre-political commitments. And we're running out of time for today, but I think one of the most important things to understand about a nation is that there are pre-political commitments. So, in other words, the nation really doesn't decide what's right and wrong. The nation doesn't decide ultimate issues. The nation has to respect that. That's key, by the way, to the American experiment. The American founders did not invent marriage. They wanted to respect marriage. They didn't even invent common law. They wanted to respect common law. And it gets back to inalienable rights and all kinds of things. I think there's a proper Christian nationalism. I think there would be an improper Christian nationalism that elevates the nation unbiblically. But I think with respect to subsidiarity and creation order and God's plan, and frankly, just trying out of love of neighbor to build a decent society, I think it's very difficult to imagine how that can be done efficiently at a level larger than a nation. Also, the nation is a legally defined entity that has responsibilities and, for instance, can be held morally responsible. We talk about rogue nations. We don't talk about rogue regions. We don't talk about rogue neighborhoods. We do hold governments in particular responsible, and I think that's inevitable. So it's a great question. And I think there can be an improper patriotism or a proper patriotism for the Christian, but I think a proper patriotism is actually required. And there can be an improper nationalism or a proper nationalism, but I defy those who want to say that you can get by without a healthy nation based upon the right pre-political commitments. And that includes, for Western civilization, biblical law, biblical morality, and a respect for creation order.